At the height of his reputation, he was careful, not paranoid, not defensive. Careful in the way men become when they believe they've already won. His name carried authority long before he entered a room. Introductions were brief, context unnecessary. People assumed competence, integrity, control. He had built that assumption deliberately. Every public appearance rehearsed, every interview filtered, every partnership aligned. Reputation, he understood, was not about truth. It was about consistency. And he had been consistent for decades. There were no scandals attached to his name, no visible excess, no impulsive behavior. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. That restraint was his brand. When people spoke about him, they used words like solid, reliable, untouchable. He believed those words, not arrogantly, strategically. He understood how fragile perception could be. That's why he protected it obsessively. Nothing personal leaked into the public sphere. Nothing unscripted survived review. He didn't confuse privacy with secrecy. He simply removed himself from situations that created narrative risk. This discipline had worked flawlessly. Until it didn't. The first signal wasn't an accusation. It was a question. A journalist mentioned his name in passing during a broader conversation about ethics in his industry. No claims, no details, just a pause. A suggestion that his proximity to certain decisions deserved closer examination. Data wa textature. Data. Sentence was vague enough to dismiss, too thin to respond to. He noticed it and moved on. Men like him are trained not to react to noise. The problem was that noise didn't stop. A second article referenced the first, carefully, without repetition. The language stayed cautious, legal, impeccable. No wrongdoing alleged, just patterns, connections, timelines. Nothing anyone could refute, because nothing had been stated clearly enough to deny. He told himself it would pass. Stories like this always did, unless you fed them. He instructed his team to remain silent. No statements, no comments. Silence had protected him before. This time, silence created space, and space invites imagination. Online, people began asking questions the articles never asked directly. Why had he been present at certain meetings? Why had his company benefited at specific moments? Why did his name appear where others didn't? Speculation moved faster than fact. He watched as commentary detached itself from source material. Headlines grew bolder than the content they referenced. Language shifted from involved to linked to connected to questionable. Still, no accusation. Still, no proof. But the tone had changed. He noticed the first real consequence in an unexpected place. An invitation quietly withdrawn. No explanation, just a rescheduling that never happened. Then another. Then a delayed response from a partner who used to reply within minutes. These weren't losses. They were hesitations, and hesitation, he knew, was the beginning of distance. He held himself together professionally. Publicly, nothing changed. Privately, he began reviewing everything, past interviews, emails, photographs, not searching for guilt, searching for vulnerability. He found none, and that terrified him, because if there was no mistake to correct, then there was nothing to fix. The narrative was no longer anchored to reality. It was floating. And floating narratives don't need evidence. They need momentum. He realized too late that reputation doesn't collapse like buildings. It erodes like credibility. Quietly, gradually, without a single moment you can point to and say, that's when it happened. By the time he understood what was unfolding, his name was no longer a shield. It was the subject. And once your name becomes the story, you no longer control where it goes. The repetition was subtle. No outlet claimed responsibility for the story. They cited one another. A sentence here, a paragraph there, always careful, always legally clean. His name appeared alongside words like context, environment, questions. Never crime, never guilt. That distinction mattered, and didn't. Because public memory doesn't store footnotes. It stores impressions. He noticed how conversations changed tone before content. People stopped asking him directly. They spoke around him. Meetings grew shorter. Agendas tightened. Time evaporated. He wasn't confronted. He was bypassed. The calls that used to come early in the morning arrived later. If they arrived at all. Some didn't call back. Others sent carefully worded messages, expressing support while creating distance. Just until things are clearer. Only temporarily. You understand. Understanding became the expectation. He understood too well. No one wanted to be associated with uncertainty. Not when reputation was transferable. Not when proximity carried risk. He began to see how loyalty functioned in public life. It didn't break loudly. It recalculated. People didn't abandon him. They optimized themselves away from him. He watched colleagues attend events he had once hosted, watched photos circulate where his absence was unremarkable. The world adjusted faster than he expected. That speed unsettled him more than hostility ever could. Hostility implies opposition. This felt like filtration. He tried to assess damage rationally. There was no investigation, no formal inquiry, no charges, nothing to respond to, nothing to resolve. His advisors reiterated the strategy. Stay silent. Let it pass. Responding gives it weight. He agreed, because responding would require a question, and there was none. Only suggestion. At home, he began to feel the psychological pressure, not panic, compression. Every news alert tightened his chest. Every mention of his industry felt personal. He caught himself scanning articles for tone rather than content. Was his name closer to the top? Was it mentioned without qualification? Language mattered now. A single adjective could shift perception. He began avoiding public spaces, not out of shame, out of calculation. He didn't want photographs interpreted without context. He didn't want neutrality mistaken for arrogance. He didn't want silence mistaken for guilt. And yet, everything risked misinterpretation. He realized the paradox too late. The more carefully you behave, the more intentional your behavior appears. Normal actions became suspicious. Absence suggested hiding. Presence suggested confidence. Confidence suggested arrogance. There was no neutral position anymore. He tried to reach out to someone he trusted, an old ally, someone whose loyalty had felt unshakable. The conversation was polite, brief, supportive in tone, empty in substance. They spoke about weather, about schedules, nothing about the story. When the call ended, he understood. Support now existed only in abstraction. No one would stand next to him physically, not while ambiguity hovered. That night, he looked at his phone and realized something fundamental had changed. His contacts were still there. His access was not. And access, he was learning, was the real currency of reputation. He decided to speak, not publicly at first, privately, selectively. He believed that truth, when delivered calmly and directly, would settle things. That belief came from a lifetime of control. He reached out to a journalist he had known for years, someone who had interviewed him before, someone who had benefited from his access. The conversation was cordial, professional. The journalist listened, asked measured questions, took notes. He explained timelines, clarified relationships, provided context. Nothing defensive, nothing evasive, just facts. When the article came out, it was accurate and devastating, because accuracy didn't help. His explanations were included, but reframed. They appeared lower in the piece, after the framing had already been established. His words were quoted, but surrounded by doubt. According to him, he maintains. He denies any wrongdoing. And these phrases followed him now like shadows. He realized then that explanation does not neutralize suspicion. It feeds it. He tried again. A short statement, carefully written, reviewed by lawyers, no emotion, no defensiveness, just clarity. The response was immediate. Headlines summarized the statement instead of quoting it. Social commentary interpreted tone rather than content. People debated why he had spoken now, not what he had said. His truth became another object for analysis. He noticed how quickly intention was rewritten. Silence had been arrogance. Speech was panic. Both were guilt adjacent. There was no correct posture anymore. He began to understand the mechanics of scandal. It doesn't require lies. It requires friction, enough ambiguity to allow interpretation, enough repetition to feel real. The facts had not changed, but the emotional conclusion had, and emotional conclusions are resistant to evidence. He felt something shift internally, not anger, helplessness. For the first time in his career, competence meant nothing. Integrity meant nothing, because neither could be proven conclusively enough to satisfy suspicion. He noticed how often people asked him how he was handling it. Not whether it was true, not whether he was okay. Handling it implied inevitability, as if this were a natural phase, a rite of passage. He stopped correcting people, not because he agreed, but because correction exhausted him. Every clarification reopened the wound. Every defense extended the lifespan of the story. He began to withdraw from conversations, from public spaces, from the impulse to be seen accurately. That withdrawal wasn't surrender. It was survival. He understood something essential now. Truth does not compete well with narrative momentum. And once momentum exists, authorship is no longer available to the subject. The story was moving without him, carried by voices that didn't need him present. He was no longer the protagonist. He was the reference point, and references don't get to speak. Silence became the only move left. not because it worked, but because everything else made things worse. He stopped issuing statements, stopped granting interviews, stopped responding to questions that weren't questions at all. This silence was immediately interpreted. Some called it arrogance. Others called it guilt. A few called it strategy. None of those interpretations were his. That was the point. He watched as panels discussed him without ever saying his name directly, as commentators gestured toward his case as an example of a broader problem. He had become an illustration, a warning, a symbol. Symbols don't defend themselves. He noticed how alone public life really was once approval withdrew. Crowds were still there. The structures still existed. But warmth had vanished. People no longer met his eyes for long. They smiled cautiously. They kept conversations superficial. No one wanted to be the person seen standing too close. This wasn't cruelty. It was risk management. He felt the solitude of being discussed everywhere and welcome nowhere. At home, the quiet became oppressive, not the calm kind, the anticipatory kind. Every knock felt loaded. Every unknown number carried possibility. He slept lightly, woke often, not from fear of arrest, from fear of irrelevance. He realized that what hurt most wasn't suspicion, it was replacement. Life continued without waiting for his clarification. New experts appeared. New voices filled the space he once occupied. The world didn't pause to find out what really happened. It adapted. He stopped expecting vindication, not because he believed he wouldn't be cleared, but because he understood how clearing works. Justice answers questions. Scandal lives on impressions. Impressions don't require resolution. They only require distance. He noticed how people spoke to him now, carefully, as if he were fragile, as if truth were something that might upset him. That tone infuriated him briefly, then exhausted him. He stopped correcting it. He began to live as if the public version of him were someone else entirely, a character he no longer recognized. That separation was painful and necessary. He learned how to exist without expectation of restoration. That learning was slow, uncelebrated. He began to understand that reputation is not a reflection of character. It is a loan, and the interest compounds quietly. One evening, he stood in front of a mirror and noticed how still he had become. Not defeated, contained. He was no longer reacting, he was enduring. And endurance, he realized, was not the same as resilience. It was simply what remained when hope of fairness disappeared. Life didn't collapse. That was the most disorienting part. His accounts remained intact, his home unchanged, his routines available. From the outside, nothing dramatic had happened. But inside, everything had been recalibrated. He moved through the city differently now, not hiding, calculating. He chose quieter restaurants, entered places at off hours, sat where he could observe without being observed. Not because he feared confrontation, but because he was tired of interpretation. Every glance felt weighted, every whisper possibly about him. He didn't know if they were. That uncertainty was enough. He noticed how rarely people approached him now. Not out of hostility, out of discomfort. They didn't know what version of him they were allowed to acknowledge. So they avoided choice altogether. He had become socially ambiguous. This ambiguity followed him everywhere. In conversations, people spoke carefully as if one wrong word might trigger something. He learned to keep exchanges brief, neutral. The world responded in kind. Without recognition, identity begins to blur. He was no longer invited to speak, no longer quoted, no longer asked to explain. The absence of demand felt like relief at first. Then it felt like disappearance. He realized how much of his sense of self had been reinforced externally. Applause, validation, influence. Without those signals, he felt unmoored. He struggled with simple questions. What am I useful for now? Who am I without permission to matter publicly? These questions didn't torment him loudly. They lingered. He filled his days with tasks that required no audience. Walking, reading, organizing things that didn't need to be optimized. These activities felt strangely intimate. They belonged only to him. Still, doubt crept in. He wondered whether silence had cost him more than speech would have, whether disappearing was cowardice. Then he remembered how every attempt at clarity had backfired. He understood that this wasn't withdrawal, it was adaptation. The psychological cost became clear at night. Sleep arrived late. Dreams replayed fragments of conversations that never happened. He woke with the sense that something unresolved was waiting, though he couldn't name it. He began to feel older, not physically, existentially, as if a future had quietly closed. He was no longer planning years ahead, only days. This narrowing frightened him. He worried that silence would harden into habit, that retreat would become identity. And yet, in that narrowed life, something unexpected emerged. He began to feel less performative. No one was watching closely anymore. No one needed reassurance. He could fail in private, change his mind, sit with uncertainty without narrating it. This freedom was subtle, almost invisible, but it mattered. He was learning to exist without affirmation, and that learning was both painful and necessary. Reconstruction didn't begin with ambition. It began with caution. He avoided grand plans, avoided statements that sounded like purpose. Purpose felt dangerous now. He started with smaller commitments, things that didn't require trust from strangers. Consulting quietly, advising anonymously, working in spaces where outcomes mattered more than names. At first, he didn't tell people who he was, not out of shame, out of experiment. He wanted to know who listened when the name was removed. The results unsettled him. Some people dismissed him quickly. Others listened carefully, without deference. Those conversations felt slower, messier, more real. He realized how often in the past, agreement had been mistaken for respect. Now, disagreement didn't threaten him. It grounded him. Still, the fear lingered. He wondered if he would ever be believed again, not just publicly, but instinctively. Trust, he understood, is not rebuilt through explanation. It returns only when people stop questioning whether it should exist. And that might never happen. He accepted that this suspicion could follow him forever. Not loudly, subtly, in background checks, in introductions that stopped short, in pauses before invitations were extended. This acceptance was heavy. He grieved not innocence, but credibility. Credibility is different. Innocence is personal. Credibility is social, and social losses don't heal privately. He began to understand what the scandal had actually taken from him. Not freedom, not wealth, not even reputation in the abstract. It had taken his future orientation, the assumption that tomorrow would build cleanly on yesterday. Now, Every future moment felt conditional. He would always be contextualized, always explained, always slightly questioned. This knowledge reshaped how he saw himself. He stopped aspiring to be restored. Restoration required an audience willing to forgive something they had never fully understood. Instead, he aimed for coherence, to live in a way that did not contradict his own memory of himself. This shift changed his internal posture. He spoke less, chose words carefully, not for safety, but for truth. He noticed how much lighter that felt. The need to convince had been exhausting. Without it, energy returned slowly. He began to reconnect with parts of himself that had nothing to do with status. Curiosity, patience, silence that felt earned. He didn't become happier. He became steadier. And steadiness, he realized, was the opposite of reputation. Reputation lives in fluctuation. Steadiness lives in continuity. One evening, walking alone, he acknowledged something he had avoided admitting. Even if the truth came out tomorrow, even if every doubt vanished, the life he had lost would not return, because the loss wasn't caused by accusation. It was caused by withdrawal. And withdrawal, once complete, does not reverse. That understanding hurt, but it also ended something. The waiting. The invitation came wrapped in reassurance. A familiar intermediary reached out. Careful language. Measured optimism. There was talk of timing, of narratives shifting, of an opportunity to reintroduce him, not to defend the past, to reframe it. A panel appearance, a moderated conversation, a controlled environment where nuance could be restored. The offer was tempting, not because he wanted redemption, but because he wanted relief from the constant contextualization, from being a footnote in other people's arguments, from the quiet, ongoing cost of ambiguity. He imagined standing under lights again, speaking calmly, being reasonable. He imagined the relief of applause returning, or at least recognition. That image lingered longer than he expected. He understood then how seductive restoration could be, not as vanity, as closure. But closure, he realized, was not being offered, only exchange. Visibility in return for compliance. Relevance in return for silence about the silence. He asked questions this time. Who would control the framing? What would be edited? What would be emphasized? The answers were gentle, non-committal, optimistic, optimism without authorship. He recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't an invitation back to truth. It was an invitation back to usefulness. He declined. The intermediary sounded surprised, then disappointed. They reminded him, kindly, that absence had consequences, that people forget quickly, that narratives solidify. He listened without reacting. He already knew. For the first time, that knowledge didn't frighten him. He had spent months living inside consequence. He had learned that forgetting was not the worst outcome. Misrepresentation was, and misrepresentation thrived in spaces where visibility was conditional. After that conversation, something settled fully inside him. He stopped monitoring the news entirely, stopped tracking mentions, stopped imagining public repair. He allowed himself to become locally relevant instead of widely known. He focused on work that didn't need validation, on relationships that didn't need explanation. This narrowing felt intentional now, not imposed. He noticed how his body responded. Less tension, deeper sleep, fewer intrusive thoughts. The absence of spectacle gave him something rare: privacy without secrecy. He was no longer hiding. He was choosing. He began to understand that the public version of himself would continue to exist independently. A rumor, a cautionary tale, a reference. He didn't need to destroy that version. He only needed to stop feeding it. That choice felt like stepping out of a current. The water kept moving. He did not. And for the first time since his name had begun circulating without him, stillness felt like agency. The silence stopped feeling temporary. That realization arrived one morning without drama, no alert, no article, no message asking for comment, nothing. He noticed that days passed without anyone referencing the story at all, not because it had been resolved, but because it had been absorbed. Scandals don't end, they age, and aged scandals stop demanding attention. They become background noise, context, a footnote people vaguely remember without revisiting. He felt the strange disorientation of being neither cleared nor condemned, just outdated. This new phase carried its own weight. When suspicion is active, it hurts loudly. When it fades, it leaves residue. People no longer whispered. They simply remembered something had happened. Not what, not why, just that it had. This vague memory followed him subtly, in introductions that paused half a second too long, in smiles that didn't quite settle, in conversations that stayed superficial. He was no longer controversial. He was questionable. That ambiguity was harder to carry than accusation. Accusation invites defense. Ambiguity invites avoidance. He began to understand that public forgetting is not forgiveness. It's abandonment, and abandonment leaves no space for correction. He wondered if this was how his name would exist indefinitely, not damaged enough to provoke outrage, not clean enough to inspire trust, just inconvenient. This understanding reshaped how he thought about time. He stopped imagining a moment when things would go back. There was no back, only forward, with altered conditions. He adjusted accordingly, not by trying to compensate, but by recalibrating expectations. He stopped explaining his past unless asked directly. And even then, he kept it brief. No justifications, no narratives, just facts. Some people leaned in, most didn't. He learned quickly who was capable of listening without curiosity turning into judgment. Those relationships grew slowly. They weren't impressed by him. They weren't intimidated. They didn't know enough to care. At first, this anonymity felt humiliating. Then it felt neutral. Then it felt protective. He realized how exposed he had been before, how much of his life had existed under assumption. Now, assumptions had shrunk. His world was smaller, but it was quieter. He began to recognize a subtle danger, the temptation to disappear completely, not physically, psychologically, to reduce himself to routine, to avoid friction, to never risk misunderstanding again. This temptation scared him, because it mirrored the very mechanism that had allowed the scandal to consume him. Silence as defense. Withdrawal as safety. He didn't want survival to harden into absence, so he made a conscious effort to remain present. Not publicly, interpersonally. He practiced being known by a few rather than recognized by many. This required vulnerability of a different kind, without reputation to buffer rejection, without status to soften misunderstanding. Every connection now carried real risk and real weight. He began to feel something he hadn't expected. Trust. Slow, conditional, mutual. Not the trust of audiences, the trust of proximity. That trust didn't restore what he had lost, but it replaced something. The need to be believed by everyone with the ability to be believed by someone. That trade felt uneven at first, then it felt sane. He didn't know yet what the final shape of his life would be. He only knew this. The story that had ruined his name had also ended the illusion that names protect people. They don't. They only delay exposure. And now that the delay was over, he was learning how to live without armor. The fear didn't come from obscurity itself. It came from permanence. He realized one day that weeks had passed without anyone invoking his past publicly. No reminders, no echoes. The silence had settled. And with it came a new anxiety. What if this wasn't a phase? What if this was simply who he was now, not fallen, not redeemed, just irrelevant? He noticed how quickly relevance dissolves once it's no longer reinforced. How easy it is to slide from conversation into memory, from memory into omission. This frightened him in a way scandal never had. Scandal meant presence. Erasure meant completion. He wondered whether choosing anonymity had been courage or avoidance disguised as wisdom. He questioned whether he was shrinking out of fear of being hurt again. These doubts arrived late at night, uninvited. He didn't answer them immediately. Instead, he observed himself. He noticed that despite the fear, he was calmer. Despite the doubt, he slept better. Despite the loss, he felt more internally aligned. This contradiction confused him. If disappearance was so dangerous, why did it feel so stable? He began to suspect that what he feared wasn't invisibility. It was insignificance. And insignificance, he realized, was something reputation had shielded him from his entire life. Now, he was learning to face it directly. He asked himself a question he had never needed to ask before. If no one is watching, do my choices still matter? The answer came slowly. Yes, but only if they are chosen consciously. This realization shifted something. He stopped measuring his days by impact, stopped tracking outcomes beyond his immediate circle. He began to value consistency over visibility. That choice didn't erase the fear, but it gave it context. The recognition happened in the most ordinary place, a small cafe. No cameras, no attention. Someone glanced at him longer than usual, then asked politely, "Excuse me, do I know you?" The question froze him, not because he wanted to be recognized, but because he didn't know how to answer. He hesitated, not out of strategy, out of identity. He could have said his name. He could have explained. Instead, he said no. The person apologized and moved on. The moment lasted seconds. The impact lingered. He sat there afterward, unmoving, feeling something unfamiliar. Relief and grief. Relief that he didn't have to perform. Grief that he no longer had a context that preceded him. This was what being unrecognized felt like. Not invisibility, neutrality, no assumptions, no history, just presence. He realized how much of his previous life had been preloaded. People met him already knowing how to treat him. Now he was learning how to be met in real time. That experience unsettled him deeply, not because it was unpleasant, because it was honest. He walked home slowly, replaying the moment. He understood then that disappearing publicly did not mean ceasing to exist. It meant existing without scaffolding, without borrowed meaning, without inherited weight. This realization frightened him and grounded him. He didn't know yet whether he wanted this life permanently, but he knew something else with certainty. He was no longer afraid of being nobody. He was afraid of becoming someone who needed to be somebody again. That distinction mattered, and it quietly reshaped the ending that was approaching. He stopped waiting for the story to end. That was the final shift. Not because it had resolved, but because he understood it never would. Some narratives don't conclude. They fade. They become background assumptions people carry without examining. They don't demand belief. They invite distance. He accepted that this would be his, not a verdict, not an absolution, a condition. With that acceptance came a strange freedom. He no longer monitored how he was perceived, no longer imagined alternative outcomes where things turned out differently. He stopped rehearsing explanations no one had asked for in months. The energy that had gone into vigilance returned quietly. He used it to build something smaller, not a comeback, a life. He invested in work that didn't require endorsement, relationships that didn't benefit from his history, days that didn't need to prove continuity. There were moments of grief, not for the applause, but for the assumption that reputation was a reflection of reality. He understood now that reputation is not who you are. It is what remains after others stop listening. That realization did not make him cynical. It made him precise. He became careful with truth, not to protect himself, but to honor it. He learned to speak without expectation of agreement, to act without expectation of recognition. This discipline felt heavier than ambition ever had, and more honest. The world never corrected itself. No article arrived clarifying everything. No voice returned to say they had been wrong. The silence stayed, but it no longer pressed against him. It moved around him. He learned how to live inside it without shrinking. One evening, he realized something that would have terrified him years earlier. If his name disappeared completely tomorrow, his life would still continue meaningfully. That knowledge didn't make him proud. It made him calm. He didn't win against the narrative. He outlived his dependence on it, and that, he understood, was the only victory available in a world that consumes people quietly.